more time. Tell somebody you are important. I need you to survive. You are important to me. I need you to survive. Keep breathing in that spirit. Keep breathing that love.
Thank you, Pastor Smith. That is totally what I needed. Is that what y'all needed? Yes. To ground myself in that love is totally what I needed. I could have stayed there a little while longer. Because we are living in difficult times. Troubling, traumatic, disturbing times. So that, bringing that presence of love that's really always there, but just sometimes that we lose touch with in the press and stress of everyday life and constant streaming of absurd and terrifying news. I don't know how you all have been feeling this week, but right, exactly. I think like our feelings are probably all over the place. Like my feelings are just like, I'm angry one minute, and then I'm crying the next, and then I'm like so sad, and then I'm so determined. I mean, it's just like, there are moments of peace, and then those are confusing. Sometimes I just feel numb. Like, what? Just disbelief and confused, and it is a tough time. One of my questions this morning, a question I've been wrestling with all week, is what are we supposed to do when the world is just absolutely going crazy around us? Absolutely crazy around us. The headlines, just the headlines, they're like, I'm calling them, forgive me, the ABCs of catastrophe. It's like, it's like climate crisis, doubts about the resilience of our democracy. There's like this awful confidence in the weakness of our education system. Like you read about for-profit prisons, the numbers of guns on the streets, human trafficking, ISIS, and now the KKK. It's one thing to know, because we all know, right? The Ku Klux Klan is out there, but, they've been more hidden over the last however many decades, thanks to so much hard work and so much sacrifice. But the KKK out in the open on the streets of America? Like, what century are we living in? Say that? Without sheets, right. No need to hide. Right, go hide again, right? Go. Except, right. You can't heal, you can't address, you can't face what you can't see. So we know there's an opportunity for healing and for reckoning and for a deeper level of addressing this original sin of our country, it's been called, of racism and violence. Racism is violence. Racism is violence. The headlines from Boston, my hometown, little shout out, we're a little more hopeful. Thank you. Glad for that. The people turned out, and I don't really know. I guess we can give God credit for the fact that it remained peaceful. Because we do need each other to survive in this time. I was reading some of the posts of my UU colleagues this morning who who were asked to be marshals of that march. And it was interesting to hear how the organizers were responding in the moment, and giving directions in the moment, to go here or go here. People needed attention. So I think, Marlon was talking about it this morning. I really recommend you watch our senior minister's sermon at the traditional hour, because he was really talking about our responsibility as a people if we're going to do nonviolent civil disobedience, what kind of commitment and spiritual training and preparedness and readiness that takes, because the risks are real. And we know how deep the hatred and the violence go. We also know how strong and resolute the resilience has to be effective, to make loving change. I'm so grateful there wasn't any violence in Boston yesterday. There is a question on my mind, and I think on many people's minds here this morning, and it's kind of pressing itself upon us, I'd say. And it's this: how should a person behave towards this American government today? It's a simple enough question. It's a good one. How should a person behave towards this American government today? I can't take credit for that question, though. It's not mine. Henry David Thoreau, who I'm going to talk about a little bit with you this morning, he wrote those words in 1849. 1849, that's 168 years ago. How should a person behave towards this American government today? He said it, that's my paraphrase actually. He's like a little, 19th century. He said, how does it become a man to behave toward this American government today? It was 16 years before the Civil War. Slavery was legal, and the United States was fighting the Mexican-American War. It's a really interesting war. Some historians say it was really the first step, a really significant step on the United States' journey towards becoming an empire or a major world colonizing power. If you remember, the war ended. We invaded Mexico, and we took their land. All of present-day California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. A third of Mexican territory. It was a war that people resisted. There's nothing new going on, really. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, was against that war. Abraham Lincoln was against that war, and Henry David Thoreau was against that war. I started reading Thoreau this summer for many reasons. One, we called this summer sermon series This American Faith, and he's a core philosophical figure in the history of American religion. I started reading him because we're in a giant empire-sized battle today for the soul of this nation again. I started reading him again because he wrote Civil Disobedience, the essay that inspired Gandhi and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And because he was a transcendentalist. I want you to say that word with me. Transcendentalist. Has a nice, does that feel good in your mouth? I like it. Transcendentalist, transcendence, transcend. It's a really, it's a powerful tradition, and one I really want to bring into this congregation. Because there are three streams or rivers, you could say, that really feed our liberal religious tradition today. We're not some like New Age positive thought tradition, for what it's worth. And the Transcendentalism is one of those streams, and the other two streams are the Enlightenment, right? This knowing that God gave us minds to use. So it's a good thing. We honor God when we use our capacity to reason and think and question and doubt to discover truth. And then the other huge stream is Christianity itself, which includes Unitarianism and Universalism and all, just the teachings of Jesus, the core of Christianity. So you have Christianity and you have Enlightenment, and then you have this beautiful tradition, Transcendentalism, that Pastor Smith and I were talking about this morning, that has a lot of, weaving, I'd say, with Pentecostalism, because what the Transcendentalists brought to our tradition is this belief, or philosophy you could call it, that we can directly experience the divine. That we are made, really, to directly experience the divine, right? Henry David Thoreau went so far as to say we often directly experience that profound unconditional love or that presence of the holy or the sacred without a minister talking. Outside of church, even without music, in silence, in peace. I've started thinking maybe I'm a neo-trans-costal mysta-humanist. You like that? I like that. Woo! A neo-trans-costal mysta-humanist. The misty comes from mystical. Anyway, back to Thoreau. He didn't just ask the question, how should we be responding to our government in these times? He answered it. And this is what he said. I answer that I cannot without disgrace, or he cannot without disgrace, or let's just say we cannot without disgrace be associated with it. I cannot, these are his times now, for an instant recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slave's government also. No need to say that Thoreau was an active abolitionist. An active abolitionist and a deeply spiritual man, which made me look a little more closely at that word transcendentalist, because I think normally when we think about that word transcend, we think like we're rising above something, right? We're overcoming it. We're transcending this world to take part in a world that's beyond this one. But what's fascinating about the transcendentalists who spent all this time in nature is that the more they focused on this world, our world, each other, our hearts, our minds, the more they found joy and love. In the midst of suffering, in the midst of pain, in the midst of this reality, they experienced God. So if you'll allow me just a little bit more teaching about transcendentalists, it's fascinating because the Christians of their times, the more orthodox Christians of their times, actually coined that term, and they were trying to put them down. They were saying, you guys are just unrealistic. That's not real. Look at the world. Look how sinful people are. This is a horrible place, right? They were Calvinists, the more orthodox Christians, and they were preaching heaven and hell, a theology that we're very familiar with here in Oklahoma. And the transcendentalists were saying, no, you're not looking closely enough at the nature of things. So they were accused of being idealistic, right? Overly optimistic. That word cosmic optimism was a slur. You know, why are you being so cosmically optimistic? But they had an experience that I think a lot of us here in this room are familiar with. They had an experience, and they grounded not just their theology, but their activism in that reality, and that transcendent, resplendent beauty and unity, design and dignity of all created things, of all creatures and all creation. So you might be wondering, okay, so Reverend Barbara, why are you talking about transcendentalists this morning? I mean, I've given you a hint with the civil disobedience. The more I thought about it, really, the more and more relevant the writings of Thoreau are to this day, to what happened in Charlottesville and what happened in Boston and what happened in Tulsa. So before I tell you a little more about his life, because I think it's fascinating, I want to ask you a question about your own lives. I think it's an important question to consider before you go out on the streets, if you're thinking about doing that. I want to ask you, when did you first disobey the authorities in your own life? Let you have those memories for a minute. Some people are smiling. I wish I could read some people's minds. Some of you may have broken the law, or not, for a good reason, or not. So I'm going to ask the question a different way. When have you first disobeyed an authority in your life? Could be a parent, or a priest, a teacher, or a therapist, a coach, or a spouse, a leader, any kind of leader, or a law. I asked myself the same question, and this story stuck in my head. Again, it might seem irrelevant, but I'm gonna tie this all together. So I think I was 14. My parents had been divorced for about 2 years, so I was an angry young adolescent. And a friend invited me to a concert. It was a Beatlemania concert. This was the 70s. Yes. And we sort of fell in love with the performers and the show, and we went backstage and we talked to them and we got their autographs, and they got really friendly with us and really nice. Nothing bad happened. They were very respectful young gentlemen. And they invited us back to the show for free, and we went back to the show for free, and then they were leaving town. They were leaving Boston. This is Boston where I grew up. And I wanted to go to the airport and say goodbye to them. And I decided to ask my mother for permission. Guess what she said? No. That's right. She said no. She said no, and I don't really remember how I reacted to her, but I do know that I had figured out how to take the trolley, the subway in Boston, all the way, an hour plus, change trains, get to the airport, and I went. And I remember coming back, and I remember like how confusing it was, right? Because I wasn't somebody who disobeyed recklessly. I liked doing the right thing. I liked being a good girl. But something, right? Something was more important to me than what the authority in my life was telling me then. So I offer that as an example as you examine your own lives, because there's not one of us in this room, I'm sure, who hasn't debated with ourselves at some point in our lives what the right thing or the wrong thing is to do, especially now, especially this week, especially at this moment in history. What's worth the risk and what's not worth the risk? What's true and not true about this God of love that we preach about here at All Souls? And what's true or not about the purpose of our own lives? Are we merely trying to survive? Or are we living with a purpose to make a difference and to make a change? And what sacrifice are we willing to make for the changes we want to see? It's really in our nature to question. It's kind of strange sometimes how liberals are so, we're so proud of asking questions. But think about any child. Think about yourself as children. Didn't you naturally disobey? Right? Mm-hmm. Who has a child sitting near her, right? It just takes until we're about 2 years old to go, no, why? How come? I don't want to, right? We naturally disobey. It's more that as we grow older and mature that we forget. We forget what we know in our heart of hearts and in our soul, right? We lose that courage to resist. We lose that courage to resist. So I'm asking you to remember this morning why you may have disobeyed when you were young, because I think it will give you clues to who you want to be and how you want to be in this moment of crisis today. A few people have told me stories. There's a young woman in the church right now in her 20s who was all set to get married. She had sent out the invitations. Her parents had done all the work. And at the very last minute, because she felt that something deep down inside, she said, no, I can't do it. She listened to a deeper truth, an inner knowing, and she did something against what everybody else was expecting her to do. And an older woman in the congregation told me about when she left the Catholic Church to marry her husband, who was a Protestant. We remember all the hatred and violence between Catholics and Protestants back in the day, right? Because she knew something inside of her. She knew that she had to do something that was against what the authorities in her life were telling her to do. Thoreau believed in what he called a universal intelligence. It sounds familiar. Just remember how long ago this was. And he called Jesus the Prince of Reformers and Radicals. And he was so anti-church that he wrote in his journals that he preferred the sound of cowbells on a Sunday morning to that of church bells. For those of you who know the traditional Unitarians in this congregation, you can see why we revere Thoreau. He's been called a saint and a kook and an icon of integrity. An icon of integrity. He castigated Christians in the 19th century for their bigotry and their intolerance, and he placed, Nicole, you're going to love this one, Buddha beside Jesus as a worthy moral teacher. Along with his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson, he rejected the idea of personal immortality, insisting that there is no heaven but that which lies about me. And he freely shared his impressions that people who clung to biblical miracles did so because there was no real miracle in their own lives. What is religion? Thoreau once asked. That which is never spoken, was his answer. So according to Thoreau, you can all go home now. Thank you for staying. I really think he was the prototype of what we say today when we say, I'm spiritual but not religious. How many people identify with that? I'm spiritual but not religious. A lot, right? All of us, right? But this is the church for people who are spiritual but not religious. And we're drawing on an old tradition of people who saw that. And it's impossible not, as I talk about Thoreau and Jesus and Gandhi this morning, not to make the connection to Jesus. Not to make the connection to Jesus. Do you see what I mean? Jesus is the one who disobeyed the authorities almost every single thing he did, right? I mean, it's like his life was a constant act of civil disobedience, right? He talked with women when the authorities said it wasn't allowed. He ate with women when the authorities said it wasn't allowed. He ate with prostitutes and tax collectors. He did everything against the rules, right? He healed lepers. He healed on the Sabbath. He violated the dietary codes. There's not a rule that he didn't break, but he had a reason. They say about Thoreau that he never obeyed a rule that he disagreed with, which is why he became an icon of integrity. Think about all the ways, it's not fun to think about this, so we won't stay here too long, but think about all the ways that we morally are compromised, right? The things we know are wrong, but we do. It's why these people become like saints, because somehow they're able to align their deepest, truest experience of what is divine and their choices that they're making day after day after day, right? He proclaimed a jubilee year for the forgiveness of debts, and he overturned those tables in the temple. Those are all nonviolent acts of civil disobedience. His whole life was a nonviolent act of civil disobedience. So here's just a few facts about Thoreau that I think will make you even more curious about his life and what he stood for. And I recommend reading Civil Disobedience. It's not too long. I think you'll enjoy it. He was a man not unlike Jesus, with few means, little money, and a sickly constitution. Paul was also sick, so physically he was not well. He died very young. He was a man whose great love of his life refused his hand in marriage. He was a man who left or lost his first teaching job because he refused to administer corporal punishment on the students. He was a man who loved to teach but had to shut down the school he was running with his brother after his brother actually died in his arms. He was a man who worked in his family's pencil factory and as a surveyor and as Emerson's handyman. He was a man who died in his 40s, but still inspired Gandhi and Martin Luther King and John Muir, the great naturalist and key founder of the environmental movement in this country. So how did this man, who had so little in terms of material wealth, have so much spiritual strength and courage? Somehow he was free, right? He was connected in his core to God. He was spiritually free, and he was intellectually free. And for whatever combination of reasons, he was materially free. He had no family, he had no house, he had no material things to protect or care for. He was free. And that kind of spiritual freedom has a power that lasts generation after generation after generation. The thing is, nobody really knew Thoreau in his time. He had to self-publish, and he made this funny joke about, after paying to be published and printing 900 books, he said, "I now have 700 books in my library, all of which I wrote myself." He was not successful on the world's terms, but he was a spiritual giant. And I really think that sometimes when we disobey as children or teenagers or even as adults, that we're seeking that kind of freedom that is our birthright, but that we lose touch with as we age and adapt and accept the status quo. I think that's part of why Jesus said, "Blessed are the children, come unto me," because he wanted us to reclaim that innocent resistance, that insistence on what is good and holy, and not allow hatred or people's judgments or prejudices to warp our minds and our hearts. There's so much to tell you about his life. I'm just going to tell you, he not only spoke out against slavery, he sheltered fugitive slaves. And when John Brown led the Harper Ferry's Rebellion, which was a slave rebellion in 1859, Thoreau celebrated his life. He held a memorial for his life, and he helped men who survived that rebellion escape to Canada. He called Brown a transcendentalist, and above all, a man of ideas and principles. He believed he was so grounded in his own faith, which we could also say of Gandhi and King, that he was fearless in the face of hatred and violence. So I bring him to our attention this Sunday, because after Charlottesville, I think we're all asking ourselves that question. How do we respond to our government in this time? What is this time in history asking of us? Do I have that kind of courage or conviction? What is worth dying for? What made those great leaders dream and dare and disobey and be willing to sacrifice their own lives? Transcendence. They had already, in a sense, transcended this world that we're so attached to, right? When we dwell in the divine, right, we're connected to a reality that we're trying to move the world towards, but that we're not attached to. And I'm not saying everybody should go out and march on the streets and stand up in front of a bunch of neo-Nazis with guns. I am not saying that. So again, please listen to Reverend Marlin's sermon this morning, because he makes it very clear what's worth dying for and what's not worth dying for. But I call both sides, all people in this country today, to think about their deepest core truth and try to understand when, because it's true that sometimes the wrong thing, what the authorities say is the wrong thing, is the right thing to do. Sometimes spiritual disobedience and inner knowing leads to civil disobedience, which is what was true in Gandhi's life. And the fact is, no one else can tell you today what the right thing or the wrong thing is to do. We are each going to have to dig deep in our own souls to find our own answers. Thoreau quotes that chapter in Matthew where Jesus is giving instructions to the disciples to go out and be missionaries. And he says sometimes you have to lose your life to gain life. And in each of these examples, the woman who lost, the young woman who sacrificed the marriage in front of her for the life she knew she had to lead, right? What was my story? I went to go see Beatlemania, which was ridiculous, but when I moved across the country away from my family, all of you have sacrificed relationships in your family or religious traditions you grew up in to lead a more true and authentic life of your own. Those are examples of nonviolent civil disobedience for your own unfolding, your own becoming, your own response to the divine will in your own life. So please remember, as you get caught up in a cycle of news, which is debilitating these days, that nonviolent civil disobedience is not about winning. It's about transformation. It's about winning people over. It's not about winning a battle. It's about transforming the hardened hearts of men and women who refuse to see and can't see that we're all brothers and sisters, created equal by the same God, each deserving of the same rights, each with the same need to be free. Nonviolent civil disobedience demonstrates a profound respect for life, its power and its potential, and the infinite possibilities born of that kind of unconditional love. And that's what's disappointing and dangerous about what happened in Charlottesville. By becoming violent, the protesters played right into the hands of the right-wing neo-Nazis. So be spiritually disobedient, and if that leads you to be civilly disobedient, make sure that you remain an example of moral courage and spiritual courage so that we might melt people's hearts. Just the way our hearts melted when Pastor Smith was playing that music. Even hearts of stone. Because really, I'm wary of anyone who is self-righteous in their condemnation of neo-Nazis. It's only common sense to condemn such naked, unsheeted hatred. So if you're wondering what you're supposed to do when the world is going crazy, Thoreau, and I join with Thoreau this morning in saying, remember that you have a conscience. You have a conscience. Listen to it. Don't follow the crowd, because the crowds on the political right and the political left can be dangerous and deadly. Figure out what you really, truly believe and act on that. If you have to take 4-hour walks in the woods every day, which is what Thoreau did, to know your own mind, take 4-hour walks in the woods. If you need to pray without ceasing, then pray without ceasing. If you have to do a sitting meditation every day for an hour to calm your emotions and focus your mind and connect your mind to a peaceful heart, then sit for an hour a day. Nicole and I and some other staff have started doing silent meditation here during the week when we're doing the work of the church. And I really recommend disconnecting from social media on some kind of regular basis. Maybe for half an hour every 4 hours. Thoreau's walks in the woods and his nature journals weren't a way to avoid action or civic duty or his responsibilities as a citizen. They were a way to ground. They grounded his actions in contemplation in divine light and love. If we are going to overcome this evil hatred that is rising up on the streets of America today, we are going to ground ourselves in the light and love that we practice here week in, week out together. Thoreau, he only lived 44 years, and he was not well known in his time, and he had a huge impact on innovative education, the preservation of parks and forests, on nature preserves, and fought successfully for the abolition of slavery. If there ever was a time to plant yourself deeply in your own spiritual practices and traditions, this is the time. The time is now. It's here and now. What do you know is true? And what are you moved to do? Not the group of people you identify with. What is your God calling you to? And maybe even more important than what you do, how are you called to be? One way to discover the answer to that question is to reflect on when you've been disobedient. What truth of your own unfolding self, your child self, your becoming self, were you honoring? Were you being true to? What powerful voice of love speaking into your own life were you obeying when you disobeyed the authorities in your life? This week, this year, I am committing myself to listening for the voice of love in the midst of this chaos and hatred and violence and polarization. I'm going to be listening for the voice of love, because sometimes we are called to transcend or eclipse the expectations of our times. And I believe this is one of those times, and that we can transcend together. May it be so. Amen.
You're my brother, you're my sister. Take me by the hand. Together we will work until we're done. There's no foe that can defeat us when we're walking side by side. As long as there is love, we will stand. Let's stand together. You're my brother, you're my sister, so take me by the hand. Together we will work until we're done. There's no foe that can defeat us when we're walking side by side. As long as there's love, we will stand.
Hey, we're so happy you're visiting with us online today. We love connecting with people all across the country and around the world, sharing our powerful message of love beyond belief.
There's something new happening here. You can now join All Souls as a virtual member. Our virtual membership is designed for friends who live outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and who want to engage with All Souls in a meaningful way.
You can be part of an expanding family, a global family really, wherever you are. If you live in Oklahoma,
Ohio,
or Orange County, California,
Canada,
or Cameroon. By becoming a virtual member, you'll be able to deepen your connections with members and friends here in Tulsa and with members wherever you are.
Each week, you'll receive special All Souls content tailored for you, our virtual members. Virtual members have access to pastoral care, to personal prayers, and also receive invitations to exclusive web events.
You can learn more, and if you're ready, you can become a virtual member today by visiting allsoulschurch.org/virtual membership.
We're grateful our ministries are having a positive impact on your life, and we want to share the good news of love beyond belief with more and more people. So no matter what, we need your support to keep this ministry growing and thriving, so please consider making a gift today. You can do so by texting
Love BB for Love Beyond Belief to 73256, or simply visit our website. You are a blessing in our lives,
May you be blessed.
And be a blessing.